So, first of all, can you introduce yourself for the audience in Taiwan?
Yeah, so my name's Danny Foley. I am a human performance coach, injury management specialist, and kind of becoming a fascial expert, at least in the application sense. I just recently moved down to Texas from Virginia here in America, and I'm now taking on a position at a facility down here called Basic Methods. And we work with a wide population, but everything from severe spinal cord injuries and adaptive athletes all the way up to current and retired professional athletes. And really our big focus is on injury restoration while maintaining performance.
Cool. So, on Instagram, I saw your education is fascia chronic, right?
The Fascia Chronicles, yes. That's the online webinar course we just put out a couple of weeks ago. It's about a 10, 11-hour webinar course that has both lecture-based and practical-based modules in it. And we were able to, fortunately, get that approved by the NSCA for CEU credits. So that was big for us.
Great. So, I know fascia is a big thing in our industry recent years. And so can you tell everyone what is fascia and what's its function?
Yeah, man. So very generally, if we start with your fascial is integrated throughout all of our biology, all of our anatomy from head to toe. And in a very simple sense, fascia is nothing more than collagen fibers, water, and elastin fibers. So the best way to think about your collective fascial system is to recognize this as like a global connective tissue. And really the main functions or responsibilities of this tissue are to, number one, help with global balancing of compression and tension. So, thinking about areas of the body that are kind of like chronically shortened and versus chronically lengthened, that's going to have a different effect on the fascial tensioning within that region. Beyond that, the fascial system is highly integrated with free nerve endings, proprioceptors, and mechanoreceptors. And essentially, it acts as a big sensory network. So one of the primary functions of the fascial system is to really help us be able to detect not only what the external environment or stimulus is, but also how the intrinsic environment is as well. And then the last major thing to understand with the fascial system is its role in fluid dynamics. So it's very tightly integrated with the neurovascular structures and the lymphatic flow, and helping to kind of push and promote fluid to different areas.
Great. So, in your education, there's a fascia-based approach, and how exactly is it different with we we just see training or treatment just muscle by muscle?
Yeah, so this is one of those questions or conversations where everything is going to be determined by the context of what we're talking about or who we are specifically looking to. Generally speaking, fascia is just a term to describe a tissue, no different than a muscle is a term that we have come up with to describe that tissue. So I think for strength and conditioning specialists in particular, we have just followed a course curriculum or an educational development that is very heavily emphasized on the musculoskeletal side. So when we talk about the importance of the fascial system or how fascia is involved in training, none of that is ever to denounce the importance of the musculoskeletal system. It's just bringing attention to an area of the general anatomy that is largely overlooked. So the important thing to understand here is that there's absolutely no separation of fascia and muscle. We can't just exclusively or independently train one or the other. Everything is always going to be working. I think a good comparative metaphor for this is to think about it no differently than we do with bioenergetics and looking at aerobic versus anaerobic input. Technically speaking, everything is going to have some level of aerobic input and some level of anaerobic input. Depending on what we're doing, there's going to be more or less aerobic or anaerobic. So with the muscle versus fascia conversation, it's the exact same thing. There are certain exercises, or more importantly, certain training parameters that we can put in place that will either emphasize or de-emphasize more of the fascial side or more of the muscular side. And to give you kind of just a quick, bullet point of how we would determine between those two, well, generally speaking, if we want to be more fascially driven, we'll have exercises that are more global in nature, more total body demand, and we'll move in a much broader spectrum of paths and ranges of motion. Whereas with a muscular-based focus, it's more of the conventional bodybuilder powerlifting approach, where it's more muscular isolation, it's less dynamics, it's more just singular or uniplanar or one specific vector. So the position that we're working from, the speed at which we're working, the intensity at which we're training, and then the ranges or paths of motion or the vectors that we're loading into are all going to be determining factors for how much fascia versus how much muscle we're really getting.
So, does that mean, like, as we see our body as a whole, and we do probably like more multi-joint movement, or like more like the movement is like more transfer the force through the body, it's more about the fascia. But when we like isolate it and like you said, like one joint, that's more about a muscle. Can I like think of it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair way to look at it. Again, in a very rudiment or basic manner, yeah, that would suffice. Again, I think when we start talking about how to differentiate between the fascial system and the muscular skeletal system, we really need to understand that both are required for ultimate performance. So, for instance, if we take something very simple and we have somebody who is very muscularly bound, let's just arbitrarily say they've been doing bodybuilding for a long time or powerlifting for a long time, that person is going to have much more room for adaptation for submaximal loading, moving in multiple planes of direction, doing things with more of a dynamic emphasis. Whereas compared to if I have a soccer player who is generally much more, kind of leaned out, not as bulky, they obviously move and train in multiple planes of motion. That's the type of athlete where they probably have a very proficient fascial function or fascial system. And we would probably get more out of doing more muscularly driven movements in terms of training input for the sake of progression.
Cool. Great. So, the next question is, what exactly is going to happen when we do things like heavy back squat or like heavy deadlift? What exactly does that happen to fascia?
Well, not to cop out on that question, but we can interchange back squat, deadlift, bench press, cleans. Like the movement itself is not necessarily the important point of consideration. If we speak to these bigger compound movements and then try to isolate, what's occurring for the fascia during those big movements, the biggest thing that we need to understand is that fascia does not have a dominant contractile capacity. So in other words, where, if I take a dumbbell in my hand and I curl it up to my shoulder, the bicep muscle shortens to flex the elbow joint and close the angle off. So we are getting concentric contraction of the musculature and then eccentric lengthening of the musculature when we return the dumbbell back. With the fascial system, when we go into a concentric action, so, again, like for a back squat, thinking about the up phase of a back squat, the concentric action is not going to require much involvement from the fascial system in terms of producing force output. Where the fascial system is largely involved in these big movements is on the eccentric phases. So fascia is specifically stimulated by eccentric loading and eccentric patterning. So for the sake of the squat, deadlift, bench, clean, the big movements, it would be tied right into when we try to go into eccentric blocks and really focus on our time under tension. That elastic or eccentric stretching of the fascial tissue is very, very conducive to fascial adaptation.
So anytime when our athlete on the court, they do probably like deceleration and change of direction, it all links to like fascia, right? But since it's not really like linked to, not bad word, when we do concentric work, it doesn't really change, or it doesn't really, what is the word I'm looking for? It doesn't really.
Well, let me just kind of interject right there, because I think I know where you're going with this. If we need to understand that the human body is a system of systems, and really what this all kind of funnels into is just really trying to bring attention to the fact that for the contemporary strength and conditioning coach, all we're ever taught and told is force output, big movements, get stronger, faster, go. And again, like, there is absolutely time and place for these things, especially in more of the earlier developmental years for athletes. But there gets to be a point where we are starting to work against ourselves because we're starting to pursue the wrong goals. The goal is not to make the strongest back squatters, deadlifters, and bench pressers. That has very little transfer or application for sport directly. So what my point of contention is, and the reason why I've gotten so, enveloped into this fascial concept, is because once we have solidified or checked the box of creating or establishing foundational strength, we then need to divert our attention or focus to different elements that correspond to true sport adaptation and transferability. And from my perspective or understanding, a lot of that is driven through the fascial-based approach, in which we are essentially trying to make the strength and the fundamental, durability more expressive in sport. And that's really all it is. So there's this continuum where we're going to have periods of, conventional progressive overload. We're going to do compound lifting. We're going to go through our Olympic phase, and we're going to do all these different things. But I think if I just took my framework for programming and compared it to, the majority of other strength and conditioning coaches, I would probably be less inclined to have major compound movements and continued progressive overload. I'm going to just deviate once we hit a certain point. And then that's where we're going to go more to the submaximal loading, done with velocity or high intent. We're going to work in more planes of motion. We're going to work different ranges of motion, change the load implement, change the placement of the load, and all these different factors. And that's really how we start to drive fascial adaptation.
Great. Appreciate that, man. So, since that, what is the role in like fascia in sports, like running or like sprinting, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So the first thing with running and sprinting, if we look on like the mechanical side, it's going to be the complementary balance of elastic and plastic functions of fascia. So in other words, this is very similar to how tendons work, right? This isn't something that's groundbreaking by any means. We have brief moments of counter movement or pre-tensioning or stretch shortening that are then converted into mechanical energy that produces force output or force outcome. So the fascial system, very similarly to the tendons for running and for sprinting, is helping to contribute to elastic function of the body. On the same page, but on the opposite side, the plastic properties or the stiffness of fascia is equally a part of the running cycle. So as we're going into ground strike or prepping for ground contact, the tensioning and the stiffness of the plantar arch, the Achilles and calf complex, and the fascia that kind of envelops the medial and lateral aspects of the leg, our ability to create rigidity or stiffness is going to help with force dispersion. And again, this is another part that I think is very important when we're discussing the fascial points particularly, is this is where we want to try to focus on building, different angles of the foot and different positions of the foot into our conventional strength training. Because if we think about, even if we're doing track and field and running in a perfectly linear path, every single step is going to be slightly different. There's deviation at the foot and there's deviation at joint angles on every single step. So rather than being, this zealot in the weight room where we have to have our foot pointed straight ahead and it needs to be exactly at this position and our knee angle needs to be exactly at 90 degrees, I'm a little bit looser with those boundaries because I want the foot to point slightly outward and slightly inward. And I want there to be a little bit of heel elevation and then have heel down and have lateral border of pressure, medial border of pressure. I want all of those things because in any kind of sport, or game action, that's exactly what we're going to see is different positions of the foot, which then change the kinematic patterns up the leg. And for the sake of the fascia, that is where we start talking about a term called myofascial expansions, where it is essentially this broadening of the tendinous base that allows us to transmit more force because we have a broader surface area. So if we have a broader Achilles tendon and then the myofascial force expansion that surrounds either side of it, the broader that tendon is, we have a wider channel to produce force. So we're going to be more efficient in our turnover, if nothing else.
Great. Can you repeat again? The term is myofascia.
Myofascial force expansion.
Myofascia force expansion. Great. So, does that really changes or how exactly does like you mentioned before, we used to chase like the numbers of the back squat, like 2 times body weight, 2.5 times body weight deadlift, that kind of stuff. But like for now, like how heavy would you go on these like big movement?
Well, again, I hate to cop out, but it really just depends on who the person is. And it depends on what the training priorities and goals are. So, if we just kind of look at a couple of different examples of that. So like for the majority of athletes that I work with, we're going to work up to as close to 100% as we can. 2 or 3, if I get somebody from start to finish, January to December, 3 or 4 times throughout the periodization, we'll be at 95% and up and really try to maximize the force output. If I have athletes that are, on the back half of their career or retired professional athletes, or I spent a long time working in the military population as well. So for that population, we may touch above 95% once, if that, right? Because it's no longer a priority. If you're a starting power forward, in Division I college basketball or in the NBA, we need to figure out how to maximize your strength so that you can maximize your career and longevity. if you are in your 8th or 10th year in the NBA, or if you're a former collegiate basketball player, it's no longer any kind of a prerequisite for you to be able to maximize your squat pattern. So we'll continue to do squats at submaximal loading because it's a good compound movement, but it is in no way, shape, or form a priority. So the level of ability, the age of the athlete, the training history, the training accessibility, the goals, the outcomes, and really the amount of injury or surgical history is going to determine all of those different things.
I love this approach. So, you mentioned like you have to like consider what kind of injury that happens. So, what happens to fascia when we probably like get injured? Things like hamstring pull, they pull their hamstring, or like tear their Achilles tendon. What exactly happened?
So that's definitely a loaded question, and this one gets very tricky. So if you have conversation with people who are true fascial researchers and fascial experts and dissectionists, they may be inclined to tell you that what we term to be a hamstring tear, for instance, is actually really a tearing in the fascia and not so much in the muscle belly, right? And I'm not here to say that that's necessarily true, but again, if we go back to where we started about how intricately related these two systems are, it is very difficult to just definitively say, oh, that's tear in the fascia, that's tear in the muscle, without obvious exception. But I'll say this, if we have something like a grade 2 or grade 3 hamstring tear or strain, there's likely going to be damage to the fascia proper that is in that area as well. In addition to that, because we have a damaged hamstring muscle, the net tension and compression of the fascia that surrounds the hamstring groups and all of the other muscles of the thigh will then be altered or modified during that window of injury, in a sense, to help expedite recovery and regeneration. So we'll see a change in that. There's going to be some level of change in the somatic aspect of this. So essentially, the nociceptors and the kinetic or the kinesthesia receptors that are going to transmit different signals based on the presence of injury. Now, beyond that part of it, if we transition that to something more catastrophic like an Achilles tear, which is more of a tendinous injury as opposed to a muscular injury, that is going to go more to the collagen remodeling. And with something like an Achilles tear, there's obviously going to be surgery involved. If there's surgery involved, they have to cut things. If they have to cut things, they have to cut through fascia. So that is going to be much more of a catastrophic recovery where there's been a direct incision across tissues. So for the sake of that, that's where we get to the collagen rebuilding and remodeling, which is something that obviously takes a good bit of time. And what is important with things that are surgically operated on is or stiffness of the region after surgery. So what I've noticed a lot, and this applies to Achilles tendons, but also especially in the shoulders, is that surgeons sometimes get a little bit gung-ho and they really kind of lock something down. They cinch that thing down very tightly. What that then does is it restricts the ability for the fascial tissue to glide in that area after the fact. If we have a reduced amount of fluid in a localized region, then we start to get what's known as fascial adhesion or kind of binding, and that's what people commonly refer to as like trigger points or scar tissue or whatever the term is. But it's important for those individuals to have routine frequent care, you know, speaking to deep tissue massage or cupping or dry needling or whatever it is, to help get the tissue to glide so that we can promote fluid to the area so that we don't get, you know, either compromised circulation or a backup in lymphatic fluid. Because if we have those two things or one of those two things present, then that is going to just continue to compromise the initial injury site itself.
Get it. So, like you just mentioned, if we tear our hamstring or like tear our Achilles tendon, no matter what, there's gonna be some kind of like fascia injury or like tear their fascia. So does that mean that we're gonna lose our elasticity?
It means that it'll definitely be compromised initially, and that's something that pretty much irrespective of who the person is, if you're coming off something like a major surgery like an Achilles tendon, yeah, you're definitely going to have to work to rebuild the elastic properties. But if we have something like a hamstring strain or a minor muscle tear, maybe not, right? We may need to emphasize getting the elasticity of the hamstring group back, or but that's going to be a little bit more context dependent.
So if let's say if it's like the they tear their Achilles tendon and after the surgery, what exactly can we do to restore the elasticity?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm definitely the person to discuss early phase rehab. I'm not a physical therapist or an athletic trainer, so the early phase of rehab is what it is, and I don't really get involved until if it's an Achilles tear specifically, really after like week 10 or 12. But at that point, once they've cleared the medical piece and they've been signed off by the PT or the doctor, the way that we'll go about starting to reintroduce the elasticity is first by unloading the body. So using either band assist or doing something with hand support or stability, and just introducing basic rudiment concepts. So very, light hops and skips, and just kind of trying to rebuild those motor patterns. Once we get to week 16, 20, 24, further down the line, that's when we'll start to go back and just reintroduce all of the same basic stuff that we all do for athletes anyhow. Again, so a lot of the extensive plyos, a lot of the rudiment series plyos, and then starting to introduce some velocity based components in the weightlifting regard. Once we clear that phase, that's when we just go back to normal training.
So, is it kind of the same with hamstring tear?
Yeah. I mean, again, and it's a good thing that we're talking on this part, because the best thing that I can tell anybody as far as the fascial concepts of the fascial based approaches, it's not a matter of doing anything differently. It's a matter of doing some things in a slightly different way, right? So we're not doing entirely different things, and it's not like this different set of things that we need to check off as compared to conventional or contemporary strength and conditioning. So for the sake of a hamstring tear, it's the same exact order of steps that are, when compared to an Achilles tendon, are just going to probably be shorter windows. So maybe it's just 1 to 2 weeks in physical therapy. They get checked off, passed off. Now we're in kind of that 3 to 4 week window. We start doing band assisted or hand supported, rudiment plyos or basic low level extensive plyos. And then in week 4, week 5, week 6, we just kind of go back to normal training. So, whether we're talking about injury, sports performance, general lifestyle, general population type of training, it's all mostly the same things. We're just doing them in a slightly different way.
Cool. So what exactly get you to like learn the fascia thing? Because we used to learn muscles.
Well, there's a ton of great information and resources out there. We were talking about it a little bit a second ago, but Tom Myers and the Anatomy Trains organization is just absolutely fantastic, and something that I've certainly learned a great deal from just themselves. The Steccos, Antonio, Carla, Luigi Stecco, are another group of individuals. I believe they're out of Spain, that are doing tremendous research and tremendous work. Robert Schleip, Gil Headley, Jan Wilk. I mean, there's so many people out there that are doing some incredible research. I think that where it may be a little bit more limited is on the application side. And while the rehabilitative world and kind of the therapeutic world are probably much further ahead of us, strength and conditioning coaches, on the fascial understanding, what I'm really trying to do is bring more information and insight to applying fascial-based concepts in more of a performance-based manner. So, I guess I have to promote myself here a little bit, but we just put out our flagship product, the Fascia Chronicles, a couple of weeks ago. That is exactly that. It's just a very wide-reaching set of subtopics that myself, my business partner, Jeremy Aspa, and my other guy, Rob Umphris, and my wife, Nicole, all kind of just, compiled onto. And it came out great. And again, we learned a lot as we were going through that process and putting everything together. And it was kind of funny because when we finished it, it really dawned on all of us, like, man, a lot of this is just really conventionally based movements. We just put a little bit of a different spin to some of these things. So it was great, man. And I think as we continue to get more advanced and sophisticated with our ability to examine the biology in the human body, I think we'll continue to see more evidence of the fascial-based stuff and see it as being more of a natural way of doing things.
Right. So from the beginning to you guys launch the education, how long does that take?
I'm sorry, how long does the course take to go through?
No, I mean,
or how long
does you guys from the beginning discussing this and to you guys launch the education? How long does
Gotcha.
that?
It was about 15 months. We definitely put everything together pretty quickly, and then probably spent about a year editing it. So it was a constant, fluent process. But this is again really the kind of the amalgamation of the last 7 years of my professional work. So it's been about 7 years, but specifically to the project about 15 months.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a lot of I don't think there probably is, but I don't know, or I don't find it anyway. But I don't think there's any other course discuss fascia in our industry. Mostly it's about rehab or that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and again, I think a part of the problem with the fascial based stuff is that we haven't been able to study it accurately or appropriately, and that goes into the process of cadaveric research and how the bodies are dumped in embalming fluid and chemicalized and preserved. So that denigrates the fascial tissue. So the majority of the research that we've been going off of really didn't have any consideration or regard for the fascial tissue at all. It was just perceived as this non-functional filler packing tissue or whatever. And I think that's going to begin to change. So as we are able to better and more appropriately study it, it will then be interspersed better into our educational development and into our course curriculum. And again, it'll just, 10 to 15 years from now, my hope is that, fascia isn't this, kind of buzzword or perceived as being different. It's just a part of what we learn no differently than the endocrine system and the musculoskeletal system.
Yeah, cool. So you think it's gonna take 10 to 15 years?
I think that might be a little bit optimistic, but yeah, I would say within the next, couple of decades, it's definitely heading in that direction, we'll say.
Yeah, cool. So last thing, okay? So if there's people are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you? And I'm really interested in the fascia chronic. So where can I find the fascia chronic?
Yeah, so we're all over the place. Social media, Instagram at Rude Rock Strength, Twitter. My handle is at danmode _VHP, and then our YouTube channel is Rude Rock Strength. Our website is www.ruderockstrength.com. So the Fascia Chronicles is available on our website. We also have a partnership with Simply Faster on this, so you can access it through Simply Faster. And we have at least 1 or 2 posts a week that are sharing that link. So that's definitely something that you'll see on our social media pages. And then we've put together a good amount of work over the years. I think I'm up to like 70 or 80 articles now, several podcasts. We have well over 2,000 videos on our YouTube channel, exercise demos, specific interest topics, a lot of fascia material, full webinars. So we've got plenty of stuff out there, and most of it honestly is free content.
Yeah, good.